In the spring of 1946, the sun didn't just set in Texarkana. It vanished. For 10 weeks, an entire city was held hostage by a phantom. Hardware stores sold out of locks. Cops dressed in drag to act as decoys. And neighbors shot at shadows on their own porches. They were hunting a man who wore a white sack over his head. A man who killed by the light of the moon. And a man who, to this day, has never been found. 1946. World War II was finally over. The boys were coming home. The economy was booming. And for the first time in years, America felt safe. Texarkana, a unique twin city straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, was no different. It was a place of optimism. But that safety was an illusion. While the rest of the country was celebrating peace, Texarkana was about to enter a war zone of its own. A war fought not on a battlefield, but on the back roads and lovers' lanes that surrounded the city. In the span of 10 weeks, this quiet community would become the murder capital of America and the birthplace of a real-life boogeyman. Friday, February 22nd, 1946. The war was over. The world was rebuilding. But in Texarkana, a twin city straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, a different kind of war was about to begin. It didn't start with a siren or a declaration. It started with a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of a lonely dirt road. That night, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were doing what countless young couples did in post-war America. They had parked on a secluded stretch known as Lover's Lane, just off Richmond Road. It was a place of privacy, shielded by the pines and the night. Or so they thought. Around 11:45 p.m., their privacy was shattered. A man appeared at the driver's side window. He didn't knock. He shined a blinding flashlight directly into their eyes. Jimmy, assuming it was a police officer checking on them, apologized and told the figure they were just leaving. The response wasn't an order to move along. It was a threat. "I don't want to kill you, fellow," the voice growled from behind the light. "So do what I say." Jimmy Hollis stepped out of the car. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw something that would haunt the nightmares of Texarkana for decades. The man wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing a white cloth mask, like a pillowcase, with crude holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. Before Jimmy could react, the phantom struck. A heavy pistol whipped across his skull, fracturing it instantly. Jimmy collapsed, the sound of his breathing turning ragged. Mary Jean was now alone with the monster. The attacker moved to her side of the car. He demanded money. She gave him her purse, but robbery wasn't his motive. He struck her, then ordered her to run. As she scrambled out of the car, stumbling toward the ditch, the killer's mood shifted. He chased her down. What happened next was a brutal, frenzied assault. He beat her with the gun, tearing at her clothes. But then, abruptly, he stopped. The headlights of a passing car swept across the tree line in the distance. The phantom, perhaps spooked, retreated into the shadows. Jimmy and Mary Jean survived that night. They were the lucky ones. They were the only ones who would ever get a good look at the phantom and live to tell the tale. But as they lay in the hospital, battered and terrified, neither they nor the police realized that this wasn't an isolated mugging. It was the opening act of a massacre. The phantom had tasted violence, and he wasn't finished. 4 weeks passed. The town of Texarkana had largely dismissed the attack on Hollis and Larry as a one-off crime, a drifter passing through, or perhaps a jealous ex-lover. Life returned to normal. Returned to normal. The movies were full, the diners were busy, and the lovers' lanes were occupied. On the night of March 23rd, Richard Griffin, a 29-year-old veteran who had served in the Seabees, and his girlfriend, 17-year-old Polly Ann Moore, went on a double date. They dropped their friends off early and decided to head to a secluded spot on Robinson Road to end the evening. They were happy, they were young, and they were being watched. The sun rose on Sunday morning, March 24th. A passing motorist noticed an Oldsmobile sedan parked oddly near a cattle gate. Thinking the driver might be asleep or having car trouble, he pulled over to check. What he found inside changed Texarkana forever. Richard Griffin was found on his knees between the front and back seats. His pockets were turned inside out, but his money hadn't been taken. Polly Ann Moore was found sprawled in the back seat. Both of them had been shot in the back of the head. The brutality was shocking. There was no sign of a struggle, implying they had been taken by surprise or held at gunpoint before the execution. But it was the forensic details that chilled the investigators. The killer had used a .32 automatic pistol, the same caliber of weapon used to pistol whip Jimmy Hollis a month earlier. There was blood on the ground outside the car, suggesting they had been killed outside and then placed back inside the vehicle. It was a ritual, a display. The police were baffled. Why leave the money? Why leave the car? If it wasn't robbery, what was it? Rumors began to swirl. Was it a sex maniac? A vigilante targeting unmarried couples? The newspapers ran the story, but the panic hadn't fully set in yet. To the public, this was a tragedy. To the killer, it was an escalation. The rhythm had been established. One attack every 3 to 4 weeks. The clock was ticking again, and no one knew who was next. April 13th, 1946. 3 weeks had passed since the Griffin and Moore murders. The pattern was holding, though the police hadn't fully recognized it yet. Betty Jo Booker was a local star. At just 15 years old, she was already a talented saxophonist, playing gigs with her band, the Rhythmaires. She was popular, bright, and beloved. That Saturday night, she had played a late show at the VFW Club. Her friend, Paul Martin, 16, picked her up after the gig. Paul was the responsible type. He had the family car, a Ford Club Coupe. They weren't looking for trouble. They were just two kids driving home after a long night of music. They stopped at Spring Lake Park, a sprawling, scenic area that was a centerpiece of Texarkana social life. The next morning, the town's heart broke. Paul Martin's body was found first, lying on the side of North Park Road. He had been shot 4 times. The distance between his body and the car suggested he had tried to run. He had tried to escape the Phantom, but the killer was relentless. Hours later, a search party found Betty Jo Booker. She was nearly 2 miles away from Paul, deep in the woods. She had been shot through the heart and the face. Her saxophone, the instrument she had played just hours before, was missing. It would be found months later, rusted and silent in the underbrush. This was the turning point. The Hollis-Larry attack could be explained away. The Griffin-Moore murders were a tragedy, but the Martin-Booker murders? This was a declaration of war. The police realized they were dealing with a serial predator. He hunted on the weekends. He targeted couples. He used a .32 caliber pistol, and he seemed to vanish into thin air. The realization hit Texarkana like a physical blow. The Phantom wasn't just a rumor anymore. He was a presence. Parents looked at their children with fear. Teenagers stopped going out. The police chief, bewildered and under immense pressure, issued a warning that would define the era. This killer is dangerous. Do not go out at night. The sun was setting on the town's innocence. The era of the unlocked door was over. The terror had officially begun. By late April 1946, Texarkana was no longer a functioning city. It was a fortress. The police and the press had unintentionally created a monster in the minds of the public. They dubbed him the Phantom, and the realization that he struck on a 3-week cycle created a horrifying countdown. The next due date was approaching in early May. The tension was electric. It's hard to overstate the paranoia. Businesses that sold locks, window latches, and screen door hooks sold out of their entire inventory in days. But the residents didn't stop at defense. They prepared for offense. Hardware stores sold out of firearms. Ammunition was rationed because there simply wasn't enough to go around. People who had never held a gun were now sleeping with loaded revolvers under their pillows. Hotels were empty. Restaurants closed at dusk. The streets, usually bustling with post-war energy, were deserted as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Texarkana had become the town that dreaded sundown. The police were overwhelmed. They were receiving hundreds of tips a day, most of them fueled by hysteria. Neighbors reported neighbors. Strangers were held at gunpoint just for walking down the wrong street. The atmosphere was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark, and on May 3rd, the spark came. But this time, the Phantom didn't go to a lover's lane. He came to a home. Virgil and Katie Starks lived on a 500-acre farm roughly 10 miles northeast of Texarkana. They were a respected, quiet couple. They didn't fit the profile. They weren't teenagers parked on a dirt road. They were inside their own castle, believing they were safe. On the night of Friday, May 3rd, 3 weeks after the Martin Booker murders, Virgil was sitting in his armchair, listening to the radio and reading the Texarkana Gazette. The headline ironically warned about the Phantom. The killer didn't even enter the house. He fired 2 shots through the closed window. Virgil Starks was hit in the back of the head and died instantly. Katie, hearing the glass break, rushed into the room to find her husband slumped over. Before she could process the horror, the gun roared again. 2 bullets struck her in the face. Incredibly, Katie Starks didn't die. Blinded by her own blood, screaming in agony, she crawled to the telephone to call the police. But as she lifted the receiver, she realized the line was dead. The killer hadn't just attacked, he had prepared. He had cut the phone lines before firing a shot. Realizing the killer was likely coming inside to finish the job, Katie did the only thing she could. She ran. Barefoot, in her nightgown, bleeding profusely, she sprinted across the farm to a neighbor's house for help. When police arrived, they found a scene of total violation. The sanctuary of the home had been breached. The footprints found outside the window matched the tire tracks found at previous crime scenes. The message was clear. The Phantom had changed the rules. You weren't safe in your car. And now, you weren't even safe in your living room. The attack on the Starks family caused the panic to boil over into chaos. The local police and the Miller County Sheriff's Office were out of their depth. They needed help. They needed a legend. Enter the Texas Rangers. And leading them was Captain Manuel T. Gonzaullas, known as the Lone Wolf. Gonzaullas was a figure straight out of the Old West. He was charismatic, tough, and media-savvy. He arrived in Texarkana declaring, "I'll stay here until I catch this man or until hell freezes over." The investigation that followed was one of the most intense manhunts in American history. Gonzaullas deputized hundreds of citizens. He ordered a check of every .32 caliber pistol in the county. But his boldest move was the traps. Texas Rangers and local officers began Operation Phantom. They borrowed cars, dressed in plain clothes, and in some cases, women's clothing, and parked on lovers' lanes, acting as bait. They sat in the dark, sweating, guns drawn, waiting for the tap on the window. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. But the mouse was watching. Despite the roadblocks, the decoys, and the presence of the legendary Lone Wolf, the Phantom never took the bait. He seemed to know where the police were. He seemed to know when to strike and when to vanish. As the weeks dragged on and the traps remained empty, the public began to whisper. How could one man outsmart the Texas Rangers? Was he ex-military? Was he a brilliant criminal mastermind? Or was he, as some began to fear, a police officer himself? The investigation was spiraling, and just as the pressure reached its peak, a car thief in a different county would provide the first real lead. By July 1946, the terror in Texarkana had dulled into a grim wariness. The attacks had stopped, but the investigation was running cold. The Texas Rangers were frustrated. Captain Gonzaullas was running out of leads. But 200 miles away, in Little Rock, Arkansas, a seemingly unrelated arrest would blow the case wide open. A 29-year-old man named Youell Swinney was picked up by police for car theft. Swinney was a career criminal, a counterfeiter, a thief, and a drifter. He was mean, he was arrogant, and he had a history of violence. When police searched his stolen vehicle, they found something that made their blood run cold. A shirt with laundry marks that matched a shirt found at one of the Phantom's crime scenes. The connection tightened. Swinney was in Texarkana during the murders. He owned a .32 caliber pistol, the Phantom's signature weapon. And perhaps most damning of all, he had been selling stolen cars that fit the description of vehicles seen near the murder sites. The lone wolf, Captain Gonzaullas, rushed to Little Rock. He believed he finally had his man. Swinney was grilled for hours. He was arrogant, refusing to answer questions, playing games with the investigators. He knew the system. He knew they didn't have a smoking gun, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses who could see through the mask. But Swinney had a weakness. He wasn't traveling alone. Peggy Swinney was Youell's wife. She was young, frightened, and under the thumb of her abusive husband. When the police separated them, the facade began to crack. Under intense questioning, Peggy broke down. She began to talk, and what she said confirmed the ranger's darkest suspicions. She told him about nights where Youell would come home with his clothes muddy and wet. She described how he would act strangely, how he had a bloodlust that he couldn't control. Her most chilling confession involved the night of the Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin murders. Peggy claimed she was actually in the car with Youell that night. She said he parked, told her to wait, and walked off into the darkness. She heard gunshots. When he returned, he was frantic, driving them away at high speed. She mentioned details about the victims' details that had never been released to the public. The police were ecstatic. They had a confession. They had a witness. They had the Phantom. But there was a problem. A massive legal wall that was about to stop the investigation dead in its tracks. In 1946, the laws regarding spousal testimony were very different than they are today. Under the law at the time, a wife could not be compelled to testify against her husband in a criminal court. Furthermore, her confession to the police was considered hearsay if she refused to repeat it on the stand. Youell Swinney knew this. He knew that as long as they were married, Peggy was his shield. The prosecutors were in a bind. Without Peggy's testimony in court, the physical evidence against Swinney was circumstantial. It was strong, but was it strong enough to risk a trial? If they took him to court for murder and lost, he would walk free forever due to double jeopardy protections. So, the authorities made a calculated, painful deal. They decided not to try Youell Swinney for the Moonlight Murders. Instead, they threw the book at him for car theft. Because he was a repeat offender, they were able to label him a habitual criminal. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment in the Texas State Penitentiary. The police believed justice was done. They were convinced Swinney was the Phantom, and now he was off the streets for good. But to the public, it felt like a hollow victory. There was no murder trial, no verdict, no closure. The Phantom was never officially caught. He was just put away. Youell Swinney remained in prison until 1973. He eventually died in a nursing home in 1994, claiming his innocence until the very end. Since his imprisonment, the killings stopped. To the law, that's proof enough. But to the people of Texarkana, the shadow remains. The story of the Phantom became folklore. It inspired campfire tales, books, and the cult classic film The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Every year, around Halloween, the town screens the movie in a park, sometimes near the very spots where the murders took place. It's a strange way to cope with trauma, turning the horror into a community event. But the question lingers. Was it really Swinney? Some researchers point to inconsistencies in Peggy's confession, suggesting she was coerced by police desperate to close the case. Others point to the fact that similar attacks happened in other states while Swinney was locked up. Was the Phantom a drifter? A soldier passing through? Or a prominent local citizen, as the early rumors suggested? We will likely never know for sure. The files are dusty, the witnesses are gone, and the truth is buried in the Arkansas's mud. But one thing is certain. In the spring of 1946, one man proved that the scariest thing in the world isn't a monster under the bed. It's a man with a mask standing just outside your window. I want to hear your verdict. Did the police get the right man with Youell Swinney, or did the real Phantom get away with murder? Leave your theory in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the cases they couldn't solve, make sure to like and subscribe. Keep your doors locked. I'll see you in the next one. We like to think that monsters are complicated. We want them to have motives, manifestos, and reasons. Because if there is a reason, then there is a way to avoid them. But the Phantom of Texarkana proves something much more terrifying. Sometimes there is no reason. Sometimes the moonlight just reveals the darkness that was already there. The locks on the doors in Texarkana eventually rusted or were replaced. The guns were put back in drawers. But the memory remains. A reminder that safety is fragile and the night is long. Don't forget to lock your door tonight.